My brother called me a washed-up dropout at Sunday dinner while his clients laughed along. Little did he know, I was about to become his biggest competitor's newest senior partner. Tonight, his most important client would recognize me as the lawyer who just cost his firm their largest account. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany grandfather clock in the corner of the Rosewood Manor dining room chimed 7 times, its deep resonance echoing through the cavernous space like a funeral bell. Each chime seemed to mock the pretense hanging thick in the air, the kind of suffocating atmosphere that only emerged when the Hartwell family gathered for their monthly tradition of tearing each other apart with surgical precision, all while maintaining perfect smiles. I adjusted the collar of my simple navy blazer, a piece I'd deliberately chosen from Target's clearance rack 3 years ago. It had served me well through countless depositions, client meetings, and court appearances. But tonight, it served a different purpose entirely. Tonight, it was my armor of deception. My shield of invisibility in a room full of people who saw only what they expected to see. The dining room itself was a monument to old money and older grudges. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge everyone from their gilded frames. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the faces of 12 family members, each one more eager than the last to demonstrate their superiority over the others. White china plates adorned with the Hartwell family crest sat pristine and untouched, waiting for the real feast to begin, not the meal, but the ritual humiliation that had become our family's favorite pastime. At the head of the table sat my brother, Theodore Hartwell III, looking every inch the successful corporate attorney he believed himself to be. His Armani suit fit him like a second skin, and his platinum Rolex caught the light with each gesticulate of his manicured hands. Everything about Theodore screamed success, from his perfectly coiffed hair to his Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was holding court as usual, regaling the table with stories of his latest legal victories and the high-profile clients who sought his expertise. To his right sat his wife Penelope, a woman who had perfected the art of looking down on others despite being seated. Her pearl necklace, a family heirloom worth more than a small house, rested against her throat like a collar of privilege. She nodded approvingly at everything Theodore said, occasionally adding her own barbed comments about people she deemed beneath their social station. The other family members were arranged around the table like pieces on a chessboard, each one playing their assigned role in tonight's performance. There was Uncle Reginald, the real estate mogul who owned half of downtown Millbrook Heights. Aunt Vivienne, whose art gallery catered to the city's elite. Cousin Nathaniel, the hedge fund prince, who treated money like a game he'd already won. And scattered throughout were their spouses and children, all perfectly dressed, perfectly positioned, and perfectly ready to participate in the evening's entertainment. And then there was me. I sat in what had become my designated seat over the years, the chair closest to the kitchen door, as if my presence was merely tolerated rather than welcomed. It was a position that Theodore had assigned to me without words, through subtle manipulations and family dynamics that had calcified over time. From here I could observe without being central to the conversation, listen without being heard, and plan without being detected. For the past 3 years, ever since I'd made the decision that had branded me the family disappointment, I had occupied this chair with quiet dignity. Ever since I'd walked away from the prestigious corporate law firm that Theodore had helped me secure, Pemberton Hayes and Associates, one of Millbrook Heights' most respected legal institutions. The firm where Theodore himself had made his name, where he'd expected me to follow in his footsteps, and add to the family's already considerable reputation in the legal community. But I had other plans. Plans that nobody at this table could have imagined. Plans that had been 3 years in the making. Plans that would come to fruition in ways that would shock everyone in this room. Plans that started the day I walked out of Pemberton Hayes and Associates with nothing but my integrity and a burning desire to prove that success could be achieved on my own terms. The irony was delicious, really. Here I sat, dressed in my discount blazer, in the chair reserved for the family failure, while Theodore basked in the admiration of relatives who saw only the surface of success. They saw his expensive suits, his corner office, his partnership at a prestigious firm. They heard his stories of high-stakes litigation and million-dollar settlements. They witnessed his confident demeanor and his ability to command any room he entered. What they didn't see was the truth that I had discovered during my final months at Pemberton Hayes and Associates. They didn't know about the corners that were cut, the ethical lines that were crossed, the clients who were overcharged and underserved. They didn't know about the culture of arrogance and entitlement that permeated every aspect of that firm, a culture that Theodore not only embraced, but actively perpetuated. And they certainly didn't know what I had been building in the shadows while they dismissed me as a failure. Tonight, however, all of that was about to change. Tonight, the carefully constructed narrative that had positioned me as the family disappointment was about to crumble. Tonight, Theodore's world was about to collide with mine in a way that would leave everyone at this table questioning everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and the true meaning of integrity in the practice of law. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the performance of a lifetime was about to begin. All I had to do was wait for my cue. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The formal dining room at Rosewood Manor had witnessed 3 generations of Hartwell family gatherings, each one more theatrical than the last. Tonight's performance promised to be particularly memorable, though not for the reasons anyone at the table anticipated. The evening had begun like all the others, with carefully orchestrated social warfare disguised as family bonding. The house staff moved silently around the room, filling water glasses and adjusting place settings with practiced efficiency. They had learned long ago to become invisible during these monthly gatherings, understanding instinctively that the real entertainment lay not in the meal itself, but in watching the Hartwell family devour each other with words sharper than any carving knife. The appetizer course had been served and consumed with minimal conversation, the kind of stilted small talk that families resort to when they have nothing genuine to say to one another. But as the main course arrived, herb-crusted lamb with roasted vegetables, prepared by the family's longtime chef, the atmosphere began to shift. This was when the gloves typically came off, when the real business of the evening commenced. Theodore had been building toward this moment all night. I could see it in the way his eyes gleamed with anticipation, the way his voice carried just a little too much volume, the way he kept glancing in my direction as if waiting for the perfect opening to pounce. He had invited guests tonight, 2 potential clients whose business he was actively courting, and nothing fed Theodore's ego quite like demonstrating his superiority in front of an audience. The first guest was Victoria Ashworth, a steel-haired woman in her early 60s, who radiated the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of commanding boardrooms. She was the CEO of Ashworth Industries, a manufacturing empire that had weathered 3 recessions and emerged stronger each time. Her company was currently facing a complex merger that would require the kind of legal expertise that firms like Pemberton Hayes and Associates specialized in providing. Sitting beside her was Harrison Blackthorne, a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire room despite his modest stature. As the head of Blackthorne Development Group, he controlled a real estate portfolio worth somewhere in the hundreds of millions. His current project, a mixed-use development that would transform downtown Millbrook Heights, required navigating a labyrinth of zoning laws, environmental regulations, and municipal politics. The kind of high-stakes legal work that Theodore lived for. Both guests had been given the full Hartwell treatment from the moment they'd arrived. They'd been given tours of the manor's most impressive rooms, shown the family's collection of rare books and artwork, and treated to carefully curated stories about the Hartwell family's long history of success in law, business, and civic leadership. Theodore had positioned himself as the latest in a long line of legal luminaries, the torchbearer of a tradition that stretched back 4 generations. What the guests hadn't been told was that this tradition had a rather significant gap in it. What they hadn't heard was the story of the family member who had chosen to walk away from that legacy, who had rejected everything the Hartwell name represented in the legal community, who had been systematically erased from the family's public narrative like a character deleted from an official history. That would be me. I watched from my corner seat as Theodore worked his magic on the 2 potential clients. He was in his element here, surrounded by the trappings of success, basking in the admiration of family members who hung on his every word, performing for an audience that had no reason to doubt his carefully crafted image. His voice carried across the room as he regaled them with stories of recent legal victories, each tale more impressive than the last. The Meridian Corporation case was particularly satisfying, Theodore was saying, cutting into his lamb with surgical precision. 8 months of negotiations, but we secured a settlement that exceeded our client's wildest expectations. Sometimes it's not about the law itself. It's about understanding leverage, knowing when to push and when to pull back. Victoria Ashworth nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need for the Ashworth Continental merger. We're not just looking for legal counsel. We need a partner who understands the bigger picture. Absolutely, Harrison Blackthorne chimed in. The Millbrook Heights project is going to face challenges from every direction. Environmental groups, city council politics, community opposition. We need someone who can navigate those waters while keeping our interests protected. Theodore smiled with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a challenge he couldn't overcome through sheer force of will and family connections. Gentlemen, lady, I can assure you that Pemberton, Hayes & Associates has the resources, the expertise, and the reputation to handle any challenge you might face. We don't just practice law, we shape it. It was a masterful performance, I had to admit. Theodore had always possessed a talent for making people believe in him, for projecting an image of competence and authority that rarely faced serious scrutiny. He understood that in the world of high-stakes corporate law, perception often mattered more than reality, that clients wanted to believe they were hiring not just legal expertise but also social status and professional prestige. What Theodore didn't understand was that the legal landscape in Millbrook Heights had been shifting in ways that his comfortable position at Pemberton, Hayes & Associates had prevented him from seeing. He didn't know about the new players who had entered the market, the innovative approaches that were disrupting traditional legal practice, the clients who were beginning to question whether the old ways of doing business were worth the premium they had always paid for the privilege. He didn't know, in other words, that his world was about to collide with mine in ways that would fundamentally alter everything he thought he understood about power, success, and the practice of law in this city. But he was about to find out. The silence that followed Theodore's confident declaration seemed to stretch longer than it should have, creating a pocket of awkwardness that I recognized as my cue to play my assigned role. After 3 years of these monthly performances, I knew exactly what was expected of me, to serve as the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when someone in the Hartwell family chose the wrong path. I took a sip of my water, the only beverage I'd been offered, while the others enjoyed a vintage wine that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. The slight was intentional, of course. Everything at these gatherings was calculated to reinforce the established hierarchy, to remind everyone of their place in the family's intricate social structure. Speaking of family legacies, Aunt Vivienne said with the tone of someone about to deliver what she considered a devastating blow, I think our guests should know that legal excellence doesn't always run in families. Her eyes glittered with malicious pleasure as she turned her gaze toward me. Not everyone can handle the pressure of maintaining the Hartwell standard. Theodore's smile widened. This was the moment he had been orchestrating all evening, the opportunity to use my perceived failure as a backdrop against which his own success would shine even brighter. That's very true, Vivienne. Excellence requires dedication, sacrifice, the willingness to do whatever it takes to serve your client's interests. Victoria Ashworth looked intrigued by this sudden shift in conversation. Are you referring to someone in particular? My sister, actually, Theodore said, his voice carrying just the right mixture of disappointment and condescension. Eleanor here used to work in corporate law as well. Same firm, actually. Pemberton, Hayes and Associates. We had such high hopes for her. I felt the familiar weight of their collective gaze settling on me like a physical presence. This was the part of the evening I had come to dread, yet also the part that had taught me the most valuable lessons about human nature, about the way people revealed their true character when they thought they held all the power. Eleanor showed promise early on, Theodore continued, warming to his theme. Law review, top 5% of her class clerked for Judge Richardson during her final year. But corporate law, he shook his head sadly, it requires a certain temperament, a certain resilience. Not everyone can handle the pressure. Harrison Blackthorne leaned forward with interest. What happened? She walked away, Penelope interjected, her voice dripping with disapproval. Just up and quit one day. No explanation, no transition plan, no consideration for the clients who were depending on her. Just gone. The story they told was carefully crafted, polished through countless retellings at social gatherings across the city. According to the official Hartwell family narrative, I had suffered some sort of breakdown under the pressure of big firm practice. I had become unreliable, erratic, unable to handle the demanding schedules and high-stakes nature of corporate litigation. Rather than seeking help or taking time to recover, I had simply disappeared, abandoning my responsibilities and embarrassing the family name in the process. It was such a waste, Uncle Reginald added, shaking his head with theatrical sorrow. All that education, all those opportunities, just thrown away because she couldn't handle a little stress. The legal profession isn't for everyone, Theodore said with false sympathy. It takes a special kind of person to thrive in that environment. You have to be willing to work 18-hour days, to put your clients' needs before your own comfort, to make the hard decisions that others aren't capable of making. I listened to this familiar litany with the detachment that came from years of practice. They had no idea how accurate their assessment actually was, though not in the way they intended. The legal profession, as practiced by firms like Pemberton, Hayes and Associates, truly wasn't for everyone. It wasn't for people who valued integrity over billable hours, who believed that justice meant more than maximizing profit margins, who thought that lawyers should serve their clients rather than exploit them. What does Eleanor do now? Victoria Ashworth asked, turning to look at me directly for the first time since the conversation had begun. The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was always the most delicate part of the performance, the moment when I had to demonstrate that my fall from grace was complete and irreversible. Too much defiance would spoil Theodore's narrative, but too much self-pity would make even this audience uncomfortable. I work from home, I said quietly, focusing on my plate. Consulting work mostly. Small businesses, individuals who need basic legal services but can't afford the big firms. The collective response was exactly what I had expected, a mixture of pity, disappointment, and barely concealed satisfaction. This was what happened, their expressions seemed to say, when someone rejected the advantages that came with being born a Hartwell. This was the inevitable result of choosing principles over pragmatism. Document review? Harrison Blackthorne asked, his voice carefully neutral. Contract drafting? Some of that, I replied. Estate planning, business formation, employment disputes. Nothing very glamorous. Theodore laughed, the sound carefully calibrated to seem good-natured while delivering maximum condescension. Eleanor has always been idealistic. She wanted to help people instead of focusing on building a sustainable practice. Very admirable in theory, but not exactly practical in the real world. The real world, Aunt Vivienne added, requires compromise. It requires understanding that success means making difficult choices, sometimes choosing the profitable client over the sympathetic one. Exactly, Theodore agreed. That's what separates successful attorneys from— He gestured vaguely in my direction, letting the comparison speak for itself. I nodded along with their assessment, playing my role as the chastened family member who had learned her lesson too late. Inside, however, I was calculating. 3 years of careful preparation had led to this moment. 3 years of building something that none of them could have imagined. Something that would soon render their comfortable assumptions about success and failure completely obsolete. The truth was that everything they were saying about my work was technically accurate. I did work from home, though my home office was quite different from what they imagined. I did handle estate planning and business formation, though my clients were rather more sophisticated than small businesses and individuals. And I did help employment disputes, though usually from the perspective of the employer rather than the employee. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known because they had dismissed me so completely from their consideration, was that their definition of success was about to be challenged in ways that would shake the very foundations of everything they believed about power, prestige, and the practice of law in Millbrook Heights. But I was getting ahead of myself. For now, I simply nodded and smiled, accepting their pity and their condescension with the grace of someone who had learned to find strength in being underestimated. After all, the evening was still young, and the best part of the performance hadn't even begun. Theodore basked in the uncomfortable silence that followed my humble admission about my small-scale legal practice. This was his moment to shine, the perfect contrast that would elevate his own achievements to even greater heights in the eyes of his potential clients. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his platinum cufflinks, and prepared to deliver what I knew would be a masterclass in self-promotion disguised as modest success. It's unfortunate how different paths can lead to such different outcomes, Theodore began, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through hard experience. When Eleanor and I both started at Pemberton Hayes & Associates, I think everyone expected us to have similar trajectories. Same education, same opportunities, same advantages. He paused for dramatic effect, allowing the implication to settle over the table like morning fog. Victoria Ashworth tilted her head with interest. "But you stayed with the firm?" "I did more than stay," Theodore replied with carefully modulated pride. "I recognize that success in corporate law requires total commitment. You can't approach it as a job. It has to become your calling, your identity, your reason for getting up every morning." Harrison Blackthorne nodded approvingly. "That level of dedication is rare these days. Everyone seems to want work-life balance." "Balance," Theodore scoffed gently, "is a luxury that mediocre lawyers can afford. Excellence demands sacrifice." He gestured toward the opulent dining room around us. "This house, this lifestyle, the ability to provide security for my family, none of it came from working 9 to 5 and hoping for the best." Penelope reached over to squeeze her husband's hand, her diamond wedding ring catching the candlelight. Theodore missed our first 3 anniversaries because of major cases. He was in depositions until midnight on the day our son was born. But he never complained, never made excuses. He understood what it meant to be a Hartwell. "The Meridian Corporation settlement I mentioned earlier," Theodore continued, warming to his theme, "that required 18 months of around-the-clock work. My team and I reviewed over 2 million documents, took depositions in 6 different states, and navigated federal regulations that most attorneys wouldn't even know existed. But the result," he smiled with satisfaction, $67 million settlement, the largest in Pemberton's history. Uncle Reginald raised his wine glass. "And well-deserved recognition followed, didn't it?" "The partnership track was accelerated, yes," Theodore acknowledged with false modesty, youngest senior partner in the firm's 90-year history. "But more importantly, we established a precedent that protected our client's entire industry sector from similar litigation. That's the difference between practicing law and shaping it. I watched this performance with the kind of detached fascination usually reserved for nature documentaries. Theodore had perfected the art of the humble brag, delivering information about his achievements in a way that seemed reluctant, yet comprehensive. Every detail was calculated to impress: the dollar amounts, the time investment, the historical significance of his accomplishments. The corporate restructuring work we handle now, Theodore continued, requires understanding not just legal precedent but market dynamics, regulatory trends, international commerce law. When Blackthorn Development Group is ready to move forward with their Millbrook Heights project, they'll need counsel who can anticipate challenges that haven't even materialized yet. Harrison Blackthorn leaned forward with visible interest. That's exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we're looking for. The regulatory landscape is changing so rapidly that traditional legal advice often becomes obsolete before the ink is dry on the contracts. Precisely, Theodore agreed. Which is why Pemberton has invested heavily in staying ahead of those changes. We have attorneys who specialize in emerging environmental regulations, others who focus exclusively on municipal zoning evolution, and a team dedicated to tracking federal policy shifts that could impact large-scale development projects. Victoria Ashworth set down her wineglass with a slight clink against the china. What about international compliance? The Ashworth Continental merger will involve regulations in 14 different countries. Theodore's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. International corporate law is actually my specialty. I spent 2 years in our London office, another year consulting with firms in Singapore and Hong Kong. The cultural nuances of international business law are just as important as the technical requirements. You can't simply apply American legal principles to global commerce and expect optimal results. He launched into a detailed explanation of a recent case involving a multinational pharmaceutical merger, describing the intricate dance of navigating competing legal systems while protecting his client's interests in each jurisdiction. The story was impressive, I had to admit. Theodore possessed genuine expertise, and his ability to synthesize complex information into actionable legal strategy was formidable. What made his performance even more compelling was his obvious passion for the work. This wasn't just career advancement for Theodore. It was intellectual stimulation of the highest order. He thrived on the challenge of impossible cases, the thrill of finding solutions that others had missed, the satisfaction of delivering results that exceeded even ambitious client expectations. The Pemberton approach, Theodore explained, is built on the understanding that our clients aren't just buying legal services, they're investing in outcomes. We don't bill hours, we deliver solutions. We don't manage cases, we engineer victories. Cousin Nathaniel, who had been listening with rapt attention, couldn't contain his admiration. That's why Theodore's client retention rate is over 95%. When companies work with him once, they never go anywhere else. Loyalty, Theodore said solemnly, is earned through consistent excellence. Every client interaction is an opportunity to demonstrate that their trust was well placed. Every case is a chance to prove that choosing Pemberton, Hayes & Associates was the smartest business decision they've ever made. The guests were clearly impressed. Victoria Ashworth and Harrison Blackthorn exchanged glances that spoke of growing confidence in their potential choice of legal counsel. This was exactly what they had hoped to find: a legal partner who combined technical expertise with strategic thinking, someone who understood that their success was directly tied to their clients' achievements. But what impressed me most about Theodore's presentation wasn't his obvious competence or his undeniable charisma. It was his complete and total confidence in his own narrative. He genuinely believed that his path represented the only viable definition of success in the legal profession. He saw his achievements not just as personal victories, but as validation of an entire worldview, one that equated worth with wealth, respect with recognition, and significance with the size of settlements secured. It was that confidence, that absolute certainty in his own superiority, that would make what happened next so much more devastating than he could possibly imagine. Because Theodore had built his entire identity around being the successful Hartwell, the one who had chosen correctly, the one who represented everything the family name stood for in the legal community. And in approximately 30 minutes, that identity was going to crumble in ways that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about success, family, and the practice of law in Millbrook Heights. But for now, he continued to hold court, completely unaware that his audience was about to expand in ways that would change everything. The conversation naturally evolved into what I had come to recognize as the evening's main event: the systematic reinforcement of established family narratives through carefully orchestrated testimonials. Each family member would now contribute their own perspective on the tale of two siblings who had started with identical advantages, but whose choices had led to dramatically different outcomes. Aunt Vivienne cleared her throat delicately, signaling her intention to add her voice to the chorus. "You know, Victoria Harrison, I think it's important for you to understand that the Hartwell family takes professional responsibility very seriously. We've been prominent members of this community for 4 generations, and that reputation means everything to us." Her words carried the weight of moral authority, the implication that family honor trumped individual considerations. This was vintage Vivienne, the art collector who had never created anything herself, but possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of what constituted valuable work in others. When Eleanor made her decision, Vivienne continued, choosing her words with surgical precision, it wasn't just a personal career change, it reflected on all of us. Clients who had worked with Hartwell attorneys for decades began to question whether our family still possessed the commitment to excellence they had come to expect. Victoria Ashworth's eyebrows rose slightly. "The family name carries that much weight in the legal community?" "Oh, absolutely," Uncle Reginald interjected, setting down his wineglass with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "The Hartwell reputation opens doors throughout the state. When Theodore introduces himself at Bar Association events, people know they're dealing with a legacy of integrity and competence." Theodore smiled modestly, but I could see the pleasure he took in this public acknowledgement of his inherited advantages. He had never been one to downplay the benefits that came with being born into the right family, attending the right schools, knowing the right people. Unlike some successful individuals who preferred to emphasize their personal struggles, Theodore embraced his privilege as evidence of superior judgment. His ancestors had made smart choices, and he was continuing that tradition. "Which makes Eleanor's departure all the more puzzling," Penelope added, with a tone that suggested genuine bewilderment rather than malice. She had everything handed to her: prestigious education, family connections, a position at one of the city's most respected firms. All she had to do was show up and do the work. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with being discussed as though I weren't present, as though my perspective on my own life held no relevance to the story being constructed around me. This was perhaps the most insidious aspect of family dynamics like ours, the way individual agency could be systematically erased through collective narrative building. "The pressure was simply too much," Theodore said, with a tone of brotherly concern that would have been touching if it weren't so calculated. "Eleanor had always been more sensitive than the rest of us. Academic excellence came easily to her, but the real world requires different skills: resilience, pragmatism, the ability to make difficult decisions without second-guessing yourself." Harrison Blackthorne nodded thoughtfully. "Corporate law can be brutal. The hours alone are enough to break most people, never mind the stress of handling million-dollar decisions on a daily basis." "Exactly," Theodore agreed. And Eleanor began showing signs of strain almost immediately. Missing deadlines, questioning client strategies, expressing concerns about ethical issues that frankly were none of her business as a junior associate. This was the part of the story that I found most fascinating, the way my former colleagues had rewritten history to suit their preferred narrative. What Theodore described as questioning client strategies had actually been my attempts to point out legal vulnerabilities in the approaches we were taking. What he characterized as missing deadlines had been my refusal to submit work that I knew contained errors or misrepresentations. And the ethical concerns that were supposedly none of my business? Those had involved billing practices that inflated client charges, discovery responses that withheld relevant information, and settlement negotiations that prioritized fee generation over client interests. I tried to mentor her, Theodore continued, his voice heavy with the burden of unsuccessful responsibility. I brought her onto several of my cases, thinking that hands-on experience with high-stakes litigation might help her develop the thick skin she needed. But if anything, that seemed to make things worse. Cousin Nathaniel leaned forward with interest. How so? She began questioning everything, Theodore replied with evident frustration. Instead of learning from senior attorney's experience, she wanted to reinvent every wheel, challenge every established practice, debate every strategic decision. It was exhausting for everyone involved. What he was describing, of course, was my growing realization that the established practices at Pemberton, Hayes & Associates included systematic overcharging, deliberate case prolonging, and client manipulation designed to maximize billable hours rather than achieve optimal outcomes. My debates about strategic decisions had centered on my observation that we were often pursuing approaches that served the firm's financial interests rather than our clients' stated objectives. The final straw, Penelope added, clearly enjoying her role as narrator of family drama, came during the Westfield Industries case. Eleanor was assigned to assist Theodore with a complex environmental compliance matter, and instead of following instructions, she began conducting her own independent research. Independent research that directly contradicted the legal theory we were pursuing, Theodore clarified with professional exasperation. She had convinced herself that our client was vulnerable to regulatory action that simply wasn't supported by current case law. I remembered the Westfield Industries case with perfect clarity. Our client was a chemical manufacturing company that had been cited for environmental violations, and Pemberton's strategy involved challenging the regulatory authority of the Environmental Protection Agency through a series of procedural objections. My research had uncovered several recent federal court decisions that made our approach not just unlikely to succeed, but potentially damaging to our client's long-term interests. When I presented this information to Theodore, suggesting that we might serve our client better by negotiating a compliance agreement rather than engaging in costly litigation with minimal chances of success, he had dismissed my concerns as naive idealism. 3 weeks later, Theodore continued, she submitted her resignation. No discussion, no attempt to work through whatever issues she was experiencing, no consideration for the clients who would be affected by her departure. Just gone. It was devastating, Aunt Vivienne added with theatrical sorrow, not just professionally, but personally. We had invested so much hope in Eleanor's potential, and to see it all thrown away because she couldn't handle the realities of legal practice. The irony was that they were absolutely right about one thing. I couldn't handle the realities of legal practice as defined by Pemberton, Hayes & Associates. I couldn't handle billing clients for work that didn't need to be done, couldn't handle pursuing legal strategies that served the firm's interests rather than achieving justice, couldn't handle being part of a system that treated the law as a profit-generating mechanism, rather than a tool for solving problems and protecting rights. What they didn't understand, what they had never bothered to investigate, was what I had been doing in the 3 years since my dramatic departure from their definition of legal success. But that revelation was still to come. For now, I simply sat in my assigned chair, accepting their pity and their disappointment, playing the role of the cautionary tale that would make Theodore's achievements shine even brighter in the eyes of his potential clients. After all, every hero needed a foil, and I had been serving that function admirably for longer than anyone at this table could imagine. The grandfather clock had just finished chiming 9:30 when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the marble foyer beyond the dining room doors. The rhythm was distinctive, confident, purposeful, the kind of stride that belonged to someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. The house staff had long since retreated to the kitchen, which made the approaching presence all the more intriguing. Theodore paused mid-sentence in his explanation of international arbitration procedures, his head tilting slightly as he tried to identify the source of the interruption. The Hartwell family dinners were sacred affairs, carefully orchestrated events where unexpected visitors were about as welcome as process servers at a wedding reception. "Are we expecting someone else?" Victoria Ashworth asked, glancing toward the closed dining room doors with polite curiosity. "Not that I'm aware of," Theodore replied, his tone carrying just a hint of annoyance. He had been building toward what I recognized as his closing argument, the moment when he would transition from impressive storytelling to direct solicitation of their business. Timing was everything in Theodore's world, and this interruption threatened to derail his carefully planned evening. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the soft murmur of voices in the foyer. I caught fragments of conversation. The butler's apologetic explanations mixed with a response delivered in crisp, professional tones that somehow managed to be both courteous and utterly immovable. "I do apologize for the intrusion," the voice was saying, "but I have urgent business with the Hartwell family that simply cannot wait until morning. I'm sure you understand." Penelope shot a worried glance at her husband. Social protocols were sacred in the Hartwell household, and unexpected guests during family dinners represented a serious breach of established boundaries. "Theodore, perhaps you should." But before he could respond, the dining room doors opened with quiet authority, and the evening's carefully choreographed performance suddenly acquired an unscripted character whose presence would alter everything that followed. The man who entered was perhaps 60 years old, though he carried his age with the kind of dignified bearing that made precise calculations irrelevant. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, and his bearing suggested someone who had spent decades moving through the highest levels of corporate and legal circles. Everything about him radiated competence, authority, and the kind of unshakable confidence that came from having survived and thrived in situations where lesser individuals would have wilted under pressure. But it was his eyes that commanded immediate attention. They were intelligent, calculating, and possessed the peculiar quality of seeming to catalog and assess everyone in the room within seconds of his arrival. This was a man who made his living reading people, understanding their motivations, and identifying opportunities that others missed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a slight bow that managed to be both respectful and commanding, "I sincerely apologize for interrupting your evening. I am James Crawford, senior partner at Crawford, Sterling & Associates." The name hit the dining room like a small explosion. Crawford, Sterling & Associates wasn't just another law firm. It was the law firm, the white shoe establishment that represented Fortune 500 companies, handled billion-dollar mergers, and counted federal judges and Supreme Court justices among its alumni. James Crawford wasn't simply a lawyer. He was legal royalty, the kind of attorney whose reputation transcended the profession itself. Theodore's face underwent a remarkable transformation. The slight annoyance at the interruption vanished instantly, replaced by the kind of reverent attention usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Mr. Crawford," he said, rising from his chair so quickly that he nearly knocked over his wine glass. What an unexpected honor. Please join us." "That's very kind," Crawford replied, accepting the chair that Uncle Reginald hastily vacated for him, "though I'm afraid this isn't entirely a social call. I've been trying to reach someone in your family all week, and when my usual channels proved unsuccessful, I decided that a personal visit might be more effective." Victoria Ashworth and Harrison Blackthorne exchanged glances that spoke of sudden uncertainty about their choice of legal counsel. If James Crawford was making house calls to the Hartwell family, it suggested levels of legal sophistication that went far beyond what they had been considering. This was the kind of attorney who handled matters where the stakes were measured in hundreds of millions, rather than mere tens of millions. Of course, Theodore said, his voice carrying just a hint of nervous energy. Whatever you need, we're at your disposal. Though I have to say, it's unusual for Crawford Sterling to handle matters that would require our involvement. Our practices don't typically intersect. Crawford smiled, the expression containing layers of meaning that would take time to unpack. Actually, Theodore, I think you'd be surprised at how much our practices have begun to intersect. The legal community in this state is smaller than most people realize, and recent developments have created some interesting connections. He accepted a glass of water from the hovering butler with a nod of thanks, then settled back in his chair with the air of someone preparing to deliver information that would require careful attention. I've been retained by several major corporations to handle some rather complex litigation matters. Nothing unusual there, of course. That's our bread and butter. But what makes these cases particularly interesting is that they all involve legal strategies that have proven remarkably innovative. Penelope leaned forward with curiosity. Innovative how? Well, Crawford said, taking a measured sip of his water, traditional corporate law tends to be reactive. We respond to problems after they've developed, clean up messes after they've been made, negotiate settlements after positions have hardened. But these cases involve a completely different approach. Someone has been identifying potential legal issues months or even years before they would typically surface, developing preemptive strategies that neutralize threats before they become actual problems. Theodore nodded approvingly. Proactive legal strategy, very smart, though it requires enormous expertise to pull off effectively. Exactly, Crawford agreed. And not just expertise. It requires a deep understanding of industry dynamics, regulatory trends, and the kind of forward-thinking analysis that most firms simply don't invest in. The attorney behind these strategies has been consistently staying 2 or 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the game. Harrison Blackthorne shifted in his seat with evident interest. That's exactly the kind of approach we've been looking for. Someone who can anticipate challenges rather than just respond to them. Which brings me to why I'm here, Crawford said, his gaze sweeping the table with professional precision. My clients are eager to establish a relationship with this attorney. We're talking about retainer agreements that would dwarf anything most practitioners see in their entire careers. The problem is that, despite our best efforts, we've been unable to arrange a meeting. The dining room fell silent except for the gentle tick of the grandfather clock. Every person at the table was calculating the implications of what Crawford had just revealed. An attorney whose strategies were impressive enough to capture Crawford, Sterling and Associates' attention represented opportunities that went far beyond traditional legal practice. Do you know who this attorney is? Victoria Ashworth asked, her voice carrying the kind of intensity that suggested major business decisions hanging in the balance. Crawford's smile widened slightly, and for the first time since his arrival, his eyes moved to focus on a specific individual at the table. Oh yes, he said quietly. I know exactly who it is. The silence that followed Crawford's declaration stretched across the dining room like a taut wire, charged with anticipation and confusion in equal measure. Every person at the table was performing rapid mental calculations, trying to determine which member of the extended Hartwell family could possibly have achieved the kind of legal recognition that would capture the attention of Crawford, Sterling, and Associates. Theodore was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying the confident assumption that had served him well throughout his career. Well, I have been working on several innovative approaches to international corporate restructuring. The Meridian case, in particular, involved some fairly groundbreaking strategies for navigating multi-jurisdictional regulatory frameworks. Crawford turned toward him with polite interest, but there was something in his expression, a subtle lack of recognition, that suggested Theodore's assumption might be premature. The Meridian settlement was impressive work, he acknowledged diplomatically, though the strategies I'm referring to operate on a somewhat different level of complexity. Different how? Uncle Reginald asked. leaning forward with the kind of intense curiosity that family patriarchs reserved for discussions involving substantial financial opportunities. Crawford took another sip of his water, clearly choosing his words with the precision of someone who had spent decades delivering information that could move markets. The attorney I'm seeking has been operating what I can only describe as a shadow practice, anticipating major corporate legal needs and developing comprehensive solutions before the companies even realize they have problems. He paused to let this sink in, then continued with growing enthusiasm. For example, 6 months before the federal environmental regulations changed last year, this attorney had already developed compliance frameworks for 3 major manufacturing companies. When the new rules were announced, those companies were not only prepared, they were positioned to gain competitive advantages over their less prepared rivals. Victoria Ashworth's eyes widened with understanding. That's not just legal expertise, that's strategic business intelligence of the highest order. Exactly, Crawford agreed, and it gets more impressive. This same attorney identified vulnerabilities in the regulatory structure governing tech company data privacy practices 18 months before the recent federal crackdowns began. The clients who followed this attorney's advice avoided billions in potential fines and regulatory penalties. Harrison Blackthorne set down his wine glass with a sharp clink against the china. We're talking about someone who's essentially predicting the future of regulatory law. In some cases, yes, Crawford replied, but it's not prediction. It's analysis so sophisticated that it borders on prescience. This attorney has been tracking regulatory trends, legislative patterns, and judicial philosophy shifts with an accuracy that our entire research department finds frankly intimidating. Theodore's confident expression was beginning to show the first hairline cracks of uncertainty. That level of analysis would require enormous resources, teams of researchers, extensive databases, connections throughout the regulatory apparatus. Which is exactly what makes this situation so intriguing, Crawford said, his gaze beginning to move around the table with increasing purpose. Because according to our investigation, this attorney has been operating as essentially a solo practitioner. No large firm support, no team of associates, no corporate infrastructure. Just pure analytical brilliance applied to legal strategy with surgical precision. Aunt Vivienne looked genuinely puzzled. But how is that possible? The kind of work you're describing would require full-time attention from multiple specialists. Crawford smiled with the expression of someone about to reveal the most impressive part of an already remarkable story. That's what we thought too, which is why we began investigating more thoroughly. What we discovered was that this attorney had been quietly building relationships with regulatory agencies, maintaining informal networks within congressional staff offices, and cultivating information sources throughout the federal bureaucracy. He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the riveted attention of his audience. But more than that, this attorney had been using these connections not to gain unfair advantages, but to genuinely understand how policy decisions were being made, what factors were influencing regulatory priorities, and how legal frameworks were likely to evolve over time. Theodore began, then stopped, apparently unsure how to complete the thought. Brilliant, Crawford finished for him. Absolutely brilliant. The kind of strategic thinking that transforms legal practice from a reactive service industry into genuine business partnership. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied moments of impending revelation, but this time it was accompanied by something I hadn't expected, a quiet sense of professional pride. For 3 years, I had been working in isolation, building something that I hoped would prove worthy of the risks I had taken. To hear it described by someone of Crawford's stature as brilliant was validation I hadn't known I needed. The most impressive case, Crawford continued, involved a client who was facing a hostile takeover attempt. Traditional legal advice would have focused on defensive strategies, poison pills, white knights, regulatory challenges to delay the process. But this attorney took a completely different approach. Harrison Blackthorne leaned forward. What kind of approach? Instead of fighting the takeover, Crawford explained, this attorney identified regulatory vulnerabilities in the acquiring company's existing portfolio. Nothing illegal or unethical. Just thorough analysis of their compliance history and current exposure points. Then, working with regulatory agencies, this attorney helped establish new compliance standards that the target company could meet easily, but that would cost the acquiring company hundreds of millions to implement. Victoria Ashworth's expression showed genuine admiration. The hostile takeover became too expensive to pursue. Exactly. And the target company not only avoided the takeover, they emerged from the process with a competitive advantage in their entire industry sector. It was legal jujitsu of the highest order, using an opponent's momentum and position against them. The dining room had grown so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed unnaturally loud. Everyone was processing the implications of what Crawford had described. Legal strategy so sophisticated that it redefined what was possible in corporate law practice. Theodore cleared his throat, his voice carrying a note of professional jealousy mixed with genuine curiosity. This attorney must be someone with decades of experience at the highest levels of government and corporate law. Crawford's smile widened, and for the first time since his arrival, he looked directly at me. Actually, Theodore, that's where this story gets really interesting. The attorney I'm describing is relatively young, with less than 5 years of corporate law experience. The shift in attention was subtle but unmistakable. Other eyes began to follow Crawford's gaze, and I felt the weight of gradually dawning recognition settling over the table like morning fog. The carefully constructed narrative of family success and failure was about to encounter information that would render it completely obsolete. But what's most remarkable, Crawford continued, his voice gaining momentum as he approached his revelation, is that this attorney achieved all of this after walking away from what most people would consider the ideal launching pad for a legal career. Theodore's face had gone very pale. Walking away from what? Crawford's eyes never left mine as he delivered the words that would shatter everything my family thought they knew about success, failure, and the practice of law. Walking away from Pemberton, Hayes and Associates. The mention of Pemberton, Hayes and Associates hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, acrid and unmistakable. Theodore's wine glass trembled slightly in his hand, as the implications of Crawford's words began to penetrate the carefully constructed reality he had spent the evening presenting to his potential clients. That's impossible, Theodore managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The only person who left Pemberton in the last few years was... His sentence trailed off as his gaze followed Crawford's to land squarely on me, sitting in my discount blazer at the far end of the table. Crawford nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of professional admiration and barely contained amusement at the family dynamics playing out before him. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said, speaking my name with the kind of reverence usually reserved for discussing legendary figures in legal history. Though she's been practicing under the name Hartwell and Associates, a solo practice that has quietly revolutionized corporate legal strategy in this state. The collective gasp that rose from the family was audible enough to make the crystal chandeliers seem to shiver in response. Aunt Vivienne's hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls as though they might anchor her to a reality that suddenly made no sense. Uncle Reginald's mouth fell open in an expression of pure bewilderment, while Cousin Nathaniel simply stared at me as if I had spontaneously transformed into an entirely different species. But it was Theodore's reaction that held my attention. His face had gone through several color changes, from pale to flushed to an ashen gray that suggested his fundamental understanding of the world had just suffered catastrophic damage. The confident attorney who had been holding court just moments before now looked like a man who had discovered that everything he believed about gravity might be wrong. "Eleanor?" Penelope whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. But you said you were doing small legal work. Document review, estate planning." Crawford chuckled, the sound warm with genuine appreciation. "Oh, she's been doing estate planning all right, though her clients' estates tend to be valued in the hundreds of millions. And her document review work has involved contracts that shape entire industry sectors." Victoria Ashworth turned in her chair to face me directly, her business executive's mind rapidly recalibrating everything she thought she understood about the evening's power dynamics. "You're the attorney Crawford Sterling has been trying to reach?" I met her gaze steadily, feeling 3 years of carefully maintained cover evaporating like morning mist. "I am." The simple confirmation seemed to unlock a floodgate of questions, accusations, and expressions of shock from around the table. But Crawford raised his hand for silence, clearly not finished with his revelations. "Perhaps I should provide some context," he said, settling back in his chair with the air of someone preparing to deliver a masterclass. 3 years ago, Eleanor Hartwell did indeed leave Pemberton Hayes and Associates. According to the official story, the one that apparently became family legend, she couldn't handle the pressure of big firm practice. Theodore found his voice, though it sounded strained and defensive. "She missed deadlines, questioned established strategies, created problems with clients." "She identified systemic billing fraud," Crawford interrupted calmly. "She discovered that Pemberton was routinely inflating hours, charging clients for unnecessary work, and pursuing litigation strategies designed to maximize fees rather than achieve optimal outcomes for clients." The dining room fell silent except for the sound of Harrison Blackthorne setting down his wineglass with deliberate precision. His eyes had narrowed with the sharp focus of a businessman who had just heard information that could affect major financial decisions. Crawford continued without missing a beat. "Rather than becoming complicit in these practices, Eleanor documented everything she had discovered and submitted her findings to the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. Then she resigned, taking with her the kind of detailed knowledge about corporate legal corruption that most attorneys spend entire careers trying to avoid confronting." "That's not," Theodore began, then stopped, his face cycling through expressions of denial, anger, and growing realization. "The Westfield Industries case that you mentioned earlier?" Crawford asked, turning back to Theodore with pointed interest. "The one where Eleanor supposedly conducted unauthorized research that contradicted your legal strategy?" Theodore nodded slowly, seeming to sense a trap being constructed around him. "Her research was correct," Crawford stated flatly. "Pemberton's strategy failed spectacularly. Westfield not only lost the case, they were hit with additional regulatory penalties that cost them nearly $40 million. Meanwhile, Eleanor had already approached them independently and offered to handle their appeals process." Victoria Ashworth leaned forward, her business instincts clearly engaged. "What was the result?" "Complete victory," Crawford replied. "Eleanor overturned the original decision, negotiated a settlement that reduced Westfield's penalties by 90%, and established legal precedents that protected the entire chemical manufacturing sector from similar regulatory overreach. Her fee for that work alone exceeded what most attorneys earn in 5 years." I watched the faces around the table as they processed this information. The carefully maintained family narrative, Eleanor's failure, Theodora's success, was crumbling in real time, replaced by a reality so different from their assumptions that it required fundamental recalibration of everything they thought they knew. "But how?" Aunt Vivienne managed, her voice small and confused. "How could you accomplish so much working alone?" Crawford smiled at the question, clearly having anticipated it. "Because Eleanor understood something that most large firms never grasp, that the practice of law is becoming increasingly specialized and personalized. Clients don't need armies of associates billing hundreds of hours for research work. They need strategic thinking, creative problem solving, and attorneys who understand their businesses well enough to anticipate problems before they develop." He gestured toward me with obvious respect. "Eleanor built a practice based on genuine partnership with her clients. She invested the time to understand their industries, their competitive challenges, their regulatory environments. Instead of billing hours, she delivered outcomes. Instead of managing cases reactively, She developed proactive strategies that prevented problems from occurring in the first place. Harrison Blackthorne was studying me with new eyes, the look of a developer who had just discovered that the quiet person in the corner might hold the key to his most challenging projects. The regulatory expertise you described, predicting environmental law changes, anticipating data privacy crackdowns, that requires extraordinary knowledge of government processes. I spoke for the second time since Crawford's arrival, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of watching my secret life be revealed to people who had spent years dismissing me as a failure. I spent my evenings and weekends during my final year at Pemberton building relationships with regulatory staff, congressional researchers, and policy analysts. Not to gain insider information, but to understand how decisions get made, what factors influence regulatory priorities, and how legal frameworks evolve over time. Theodore stared at me as if I were a stranger who had somehow taken the place of his sister. "You were planning this while you were still at the firm?" "I was planning to practice law the way it should be practiced," I replied, "ethically, strategically, and in genuine service to clients rather than firm profit margins." Crawford nodded approvingly. "Which brings us to why I'm here tonight." Crawford reached into his briefcase with the deliberate movements of a man who understood that what he was about to reveal would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the room. The leather portfolio he withdrew was thick with documents, each tab marking what I suspected were case files that would serve as irrefutable proof of everything he had been describing. "Eleanor," he said, turning to address me directly while the rest of the table watched in stunned silence, "I hope you'll forgive the dramatic presentation, but sometimes concrete evidence speaks louder than testimonials." He opened the portfolio and began spreading documents across the white linen tablecloth with the precision of a dealer laying out cards. Each page that emerged seemed to carry more weight than the last. Letterheads from Fortune 500 companies, legal briefs bearing federal court seals, settlement agreements with dollar amounts that made the family's collective net worth seem modest by comparison. "The Ashworth Industries Preliminary Assessment," Crawford announced, placing the first document where Victoria Ashworth could see it clearly. Her name was prominently displayed at the top, along with her company's logo and a date from just 2 weeks prior. "Eleanor completed this analysis of your merger complications before my firm even knew you were considering new legal counsel." Victoria's eyes widened as she recognized her own company's confidential information laid out in meticulous detail. "How did you obtain our internal documents?" "I didn't," I replied calmly. "Everything in that analysis comes from public filings, regulatory databases, and industry reports that anyone can access. The difference is knowing what to look for and how to synthesize the information into actionable legal strategy." Crawford nodded approvingly. "Eleanor identified 17 potential regulatory roadblocks to your merger, 12 of which my firm's initial assessment missed entirely. More importantly, she developed workaround strategies for each obstacle that would not only expedite the approval process, but position the merged entity for significant tax advantages." He placed another document in front of Harrison Blackthorne. "The Millbrook Heights Development Project Analysis. Eleanor predicted the zoning challenges you're currently facing 3 months before they materialized and drafted the appeals briefs that will resolve them." Harrison picked up the document with trembling hands, scanning pages of legal arguments that addressed issues his own attorneys were still struggling to understand. "These are the exact problems we've been dealing with for the past 6 weeks. How could you have known?" "Municipal politics follow predictable patterns," I explained. "City council voting records, planning commission minutes, citizen petition histories. It's all public information if you know how to analyze it systematically. Your project was always going to face opposition from the Riverside Neighborhood Association, and their legal challenges were always going to focus on environmental impact rather than traffic concerns." Theodore had been studying the documents with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching natural disasters unfold. "Eleanor, these cases, some of these companies are our clients, were our clients." Crawford's smile carried a hint of satisfaction that suggested this revelation had been carefully timed. The Meridian Corporation case that you mentioned so proudly earlier this evening? Eleanor handled their appeal after Pemberton's settlement proved inadequate to protect them from follow-up litigation. He produced another set of documents, these bearing the Meridian Corporation letterhead, and dated 6 months after Theodore's supposedly triumphant settlement. The $67 million settlement you negotiated left Meridian vulnerable to class action suits from shareholders who claimed the company had hidden the scope of its regulatory violations. Eleanor's appeal strategy not only defeated those suits, but recovered $32 million in legal fees that Pemberton had charged for unnecessary work. Theodore's face had gone completely white. "That's not. We provided excellent service to Meridian. They were satisfied with our representation." "Were they?" Crawford asked, producing what appeared to be a formal letter on Meridian Corporation's stationery. "This is their official notification terminating Pemberton, Hayes & Associates as counsel of record, dated 8 months ago. They cited concerns about billing practices and strategic effectiveness." The letter hit the table with a soft rustle that seemed disproportionately loud in the sudden silence. Theodore stared at it as if it might spontaneously combust, his carefully constructed professional identity crumbling with each revelation. But Crawford wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the broader family, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture to students who had been working from incorrect textbooks. Over the past 3 years, Eleanor has quietly become the preferred counsel for companies that need sophisticated legal strategy rather than expensive legal theater. Her client roster reads like a who's who of regional corporate leadership. He began laying out client lists, retainer agreements, and testimonial letters with methodical precision. Each document seemed to represent another nail in the coffin of the family narrative that had positioned Eleanor as the failure and Theodore as the success. Quantum Dynamics, the tech startup that just went public for $8 billion. Eleanor structured their initial incorporation and guided them through 3 rounds of venture capital fundraising. Her fee for that work exceeded Theodore's entire annual billing by a factor of 4. Aunt Vivienne made a small choking sound. 4 times Theodore's annual billing? Continental Manufacturing, the company that successfully fought off the hostile takeover I mentioned earlier? Eleanor's strategic approach didn't just save the company, it positioned them to acquire 2 competitors and expand their market share by 40%. They've retained her as general counsel at a rate that most senior partners at major firms would envy. Uncle Reginald was doing rapid mental calculations, his real estate developer's brain working to process the financial implications of what Crawford was describing. What kind of rates are we talking about? Crawford consulted his documents with the air of someone who had anticipated this question. Eleanor's standard retainer for complex corporate matters is $2 million, with additional fees based on outcomes achieved. Her success rate for preventing costly litigation through proactive strategy development is currently 97%. The numbers hung in the air like incense, overwhelming in their implications. I watched the faces around the table as family members tried to reconcile these figures with their image of me as the sister who couldn't handle the pressure of corporate law practice. But the most impressive validation of Eleanor's approach, Crawford continued, comes from an unexpected source. He paused dramatically, clearly savoring the moment. 3 months ago, Crawford Sterling and Associates was retained by the State Bar Association to investigate allegations of systematic billing fraud at several major law firms in the region. Theodore's wine glass slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering against his plate with a crystalline crash that seemed to echo through the dining room. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. Our investigation found evidence of widespread unethical practices, inflated billing, unnecessary work, client manipulation designed to maximize fees rather than achieve results. The firms involved are facing sanctions, potential criminal charges, and civil liability that could total hundreds of millions of dollars. Crawford's eyes found Theodore's across the table. Pemberton, Hayes & Associates is at the top of that list, And the evidence that launched this investigation? It came from detailed documentation submitted 3 years ago by a former associate who had discovered the pattern of corruption and reported it to the appropriate authorities. He placed a final document on the table, a letter bearing the seal of the State Bar Association and addressed to Eleanor Hartwell, commending her for her professional integrity and civic responsibility in exposing practices that had damaged the reputation of the entire legal profession. Eleanor didn't leave Pemberton because she couldn't handle the pressure, Crawford concluded. She left because she refused to be complicit in corruption. And while the legal establishment scrambles to clean up the mess left by firms like Pemberton, Eleanor has been quietly building the kind of practice that represents the future of corporate law. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the soft sound of Uncle Reginald pouring himself a very large whiskey. The transformation of the dining room's atmosphere was instantaneous and complete. What had been a carefully orchestrated performance of family superiority dissolved into chaos as thoroughly as sugar dissolving in hot water. The revelation of Eleanor's true success had shattered the established social order, leaving everyone scrambling to understand their new positions in a hierarchy that had been completely inverted. Victoria Ashworth was the first to recover from the shock, her corporate executive instincts overriding social confusion as she processed the business implications of what she had just learned. She turned away from Theodore entirely, her body language dismissing him as completely as if he had ceased to exist, and focused her full attention on Eleanor. "The merger analysis you mentioned," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions under pressure. "When can we schedule a formal presentation? I need to see the complete strategic framework, including timeline projections and regulatory compliance protocols." Before Eleanor could respond, Harrison Blackthorne was leaning across the table with desperate urgency. "The zoning appeals briefs, are they ready for filing? We're facing a city council vote in 10 days, and if your analysis is correct, we need to act immediately to preserve our development rights." The sudden competition for Eleanor's attention was like watching sharks respond to blood in the water. Two of the most successful business leaders in the region were simultaneously attempting to secure legal counsel from someone they had dismissed as irrelevant just minutes earlier. Theodore sat frozen in his chair, watching his carefully cultivated potential clients pivot away from him with the kind of brutal efficiency that characterizes high-stakes business decisions. The confident attorney who had been holding court at the beginning of the evening now looked like a man witnessing his own professional funeral. "Wait," Penelope stammered, her voice shrill with confusion and growing panic. "This can't be right. Eleanor works from home, in casual clothes. She doesn't even have a proper office." Crawford chuckled softly, clearly enjoying the family's struggle to reconcile their assumptions with reality. "Eleanor maintains a private office on the 37th floor of the Millennium Tower. The entire floor, actually. She purchased it 18 months ago when her practice outgrew more traditional arrangements." Aunt Vivienne made a strangled sound. "The entire floor? Of the Millennium Tower? The views are quite spectacular," Crawford continued with deliberate nonchalance. "Though I understand Eleanor chose the location primarily for its proximity to federal court facilities and regulatory offices, rather than for aesthetic considerations." Uncle Reginald had pulled out his phone and was frantically searching real estate databases. "The Millennium Tower penthouse floors! Jesus Christ, Eleanor! Do you know what those spaces cost? The maintenance fees alone would bankrupt most law practices." "Eleanor's practice isn't most law practices," Crawford replied. "Her annual revenue exceeded $47 million last year, with profit margins that would make investment banks envious. When you provide genuine value rather than billable hours, clients are willing to pay accordingly." The number hit the table like a physical blow. $47 million. Theodore's entire career at Pemberton Hayes & Associates, his proudest achievements, his most celebrated victories, represented a fraction of what Eleanor had accomplished in a single year of independent practice. Cousin Nathaniel was staring at Eleanor with the kind of awed respect usually reserved for natural phenomena. "How did you hide this?" For 3 years. How did nobody in the family know what you were building? Eleanor spoke for the first time since the chaos had begun, her voice calm and measured in sharp contrast to the emotional turbulence surrounding her. You never asked. Any of you. You were so committed to your narrative about my failure that you never showed the slightest curiosity about what I was actually doing with my time. The truth of that statement settled over the family like a blanket of collective shame. Every monthly dinner, every casual conversation, every family gathering, they had discussed Eleanor's supposed struggles without ever once asking for her perspective on her own life. The consulting work from home that I mentioned, Eleanor continued, her tone remaining deliberately neutral. Those were conference calls with Fortune 500 CEOs who needed legal strategy advice they couldn't get from their traditional counsel. The casual clothes? I've found that comfort improves analytical thinking, and my clients care more about results than appearance. Theodore finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. The stories about your breakdown, about not being able to handle the pressure, were convenient fictions that allowed you to feel superior, Eleanor replied with surgical precision. I never corrected them because I had no interest in your validation or approval. I was building something that mattered more than family opinion. Crawford nodded approvingly. Which brings us to the reason for my visit tonight. Eleanor, my clients are prepared to offer you a partnership arrangement that would make Crawford, Sterling & Associates the most formidable legal consortium on the East Coast. He placed a formal document on the table, its letterhead bearing both firm names in elegant script, Crawford, Sterling & Hartwell Associates, senior partner status, with full autonomy over your existing practice and client relationships. Base compensation of $15 million annually, plus percentage participation in all major case revenues. Victoria Ashworth's eyes widened at the figures being discussed. This wasn't just legal success. This was wealth that bordered on the obscene, the kind of professional achievement that redefined entire industries. But Harrison Blackthorne was more practical in his response. Eleanor, before you make any partnership decisions, I need to know, are you available to take on the Millbrook Heights project? Whatever Crawford's offering, I'll double it if you'll handle our legal needs exclusively. That's not how Eleanor operates, Crawford interjected smoothly. She doesn't accept exclusive arrangements. Her practice is built on serving multiple clients with complementary rather than competing interests. The dining room had transformed into an impromptu business negotiation, with some of the most powerful people in the region competing for access to legal services they hadn't even known existed an hour earlier. The family dinner had become a bidding war, and Eleanor, the supposed failure, had somehow become the most valuable person in the room. Theodore pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. I need some air, he mumbled, stumbling toward the French doors that led to the manor's gardens. Penelope rose to follow him, but Eleanor's voice stopped her. Let him go. He needs time to process what this means for his career at Pemberton. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If Pemberton, Hayes and Associates was facing sanctions for the very practices Theodore had defended and participated in, his professional future was considerably more precarious than anyone had realized. Eleanor, Aunt Vivienne said, her voice small and uncertain, why didn't you tell us? All these years, why did you let us believe? Because, Eleanor replied with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to confused children, your belief in my failure was irrelevant to my success. I didn't need your approval to build what I've built, and I certainly didn't need your permission to prove that there are better ways to practice law than the corrupt systems you've always celebrated. The accusation embedded in her response was unmistakable. The family hadn't just been wrong about Eleanor's capabilities. They had been wrong about what constituted success, what mattered in professional practice, and what kind of achievements were worth celebrating. Crawford gathered his documents with the satisfaction of someone whose mission had been accomplished beyond his most optimistic expectations. Eleanor, I'll need your decision about the partnership offer within the week. My clients are eager to finalize arrangements before word of this opportunity reaches other firms. As he prepared to leave, the dining room that had hosted a traditional family dinner just hours earlier looked like the aftermath of a corporate battlefield, with allegiances shifted, assumptions shattered, and a new hierarchy established through the simple revelation of truth. The silence that followed Crawford's departure stretched across the manor like a heavy fog, broken only by the distant sound of Theodore pacing on the garden terrace beyond the French doors. Inside the dining room, the scattered documents on the white tablecloth served as physical reminders of how completely the evening's assumptions had been shattered. The carefully arranged dinner setting now looked like the aftermath of a financial earthquake, with family members sitting in stunned contemplation of a reality none of them had seen coming. Eleanor remained in her chair, observing the collective processing with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a particularly fascinating social collapse. 3 years of careful planning had led to this moment, though she had never imagined the revelation would unfold quite so dramatically or so publicly. Crawford's timing had been impeccable, his presentation masterfully orchestrated to maximize both impact and witnesses. Victoria Ashworth was the first to break the contemplative silence, her business executive's mind working through implications with systematic precision. "Eleanor, I need to understand the scope of what you're offering. The merger analysis Crawford showed us, is that representative of your standard preliminary assessment?" "That was actually abbreviated," Eleanor replied, her tone professional but not unfriendly. "A complete strategic framework would include regulatory timeline mapping, competitive response modeling, and stakeholder impact analysis. The preliminary document was designed to demonstrate analytical approach rather than comprehensive planning." Victoria's eyes sharpened with interest. How long would a complete analysis require? For a merger of Ashworth Industries' complexity, 6 weeks for initial framework development, with ongoing refinement as variables change during the negotiation process. Eleanor paused, considering. "Though given the federal regulatory climate, I'd recommend beginning with environmental impact assessment and antitrust vulnerability analysis before proceeding with integration planning." Harrison Blackthorne leaned forward eagerly. "And the Millbrook Heights project? You mentioned having appeals briefs already prepared?" Eleanor nodded. "The briefs are complete and ready for filing. But more importantly, I've identified 4 alternative development approaches that would avoid the zoning conflicts entirely while potentially increasing your projected returns by 15 to 20%. The casual mention of increasing returns by millions of dollars seemed to hang in the air like perfume, intoxicating in its implications. These weren't theoretical legal strategies. They were concrete business solutions that could transform major corporate projects. Uncle Reginald had been unusually quiet, but now he cleared his throat with the gravity of a family patriarch confronting uncomfortable truths. "Eleanor, I need to ask this directly. How long have you been operating at this level? This isn't something that develops overnight." "The foundation was laid during my final year at Pemberton," Eleanor replied. "I spent evenings and weekends building the analytical framework, developing regulatory contacts, and identifying the inefficiencies in traditional corporate legal practice. The first major client came 4 months after I established independent practice." "4 months," Aunt Vivienne repeated faintly. "We were still talking about you getting therapy." The irony was sharp enough to cut crystal. While the family had been constructing narratives about Eleanor's need for psychological support, she had been building relationships with some of the most sophisticated business leaders in the region. Cousin Nathaniel was studying the documents Crawford had left behind with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. The client list, Eleanor. Some of these companies are publicly traded. Their legal expenditures would be disclosed in SEC filings. How did nobody notice that a solo practitioner was handling this level of work? Eleanor smiled for the first time since Crawford's arrival, the expression carrying just a hint of satisfaction. Corporate legal expenses are typically reported in aggregate figures. Individual attorney identification isn't required unless it involves contingency arrangements or equity compensation. Most of my clients prefer discretion regarding their legal counsel choices. Discretion? Uncle Reginald repeated thoughtfully. Because hiring an unknown solo practitioner instead of an established firm might raise questions about judgment among shareholders and board members. Initially, yes, Eleanor agreed, though success tends to overcome skepticism quickly. Several clients now actively publicize their use of innovative legal strategies as competitive advantages. Penelope had returned from checking on Theodore, her expression troubled. "He's not taking this well," she announced unnecessarily. "He keeps talking about how this will affect his partnership track at Pemberton." The mention of Pemberton cast a shadow over the conversation. Crawford's revelation about the Bar Association investigation meant that Theodore's professional future was considerably more precarious than anyone had realized just hours earlier. "What exactly is going to happen to Pemberton?" Victoria asked, her question carrying both curiosity and concern about potential disruption to the local legal market. Eleanor considered her response carefully. "The investigation is ongoing, but firms facing systematic billing fraud allegations typically undergo significant restructuring. Partner departures, client defections, regulatory oversight. It's usually a process that takes several years to resolve completely." "And Theodore's position there?" "Will depend on his level of involvement in the practices being investigated," Eleanor replied diplomatically, though junior partners who weren't aware of systematic issues sometimes emerge with reduced consequences. It was a generous assessment, particularly given Theodore's enthusiastic defense of Pemberton's approaches throughout the evening. Eleanor was offering her brother the benefit of doubt he had never extended to her. The sound of a car engine in the driveway drew everyone's attention. Through the dining room windows, they could see headlights sweeping across the manor's facade as a vehicle pulled into the circular drive. "That's probably Mother," Penelope said, checking her watch. "She said she might stop by after her bridge club meeting." The prospect of explaining the evening's revelations to the family matriarch added another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. Margaret Hartwell had been the primary architect of the family narratives about success and failure, the keeper of social standards and professional expectations. Eleanor rose from her chair with fluid grace, gathering the documents that had been scattered across the table. "I should probably leave before she arrives. This is enough shock for one evening." "Wait," Victoria called out urgently. "We haven't finished discussing representation arrangements. I need to know if you're available for the merger project." "And I need those development alternatives you mentioned," Harrison added with equal urgency. Eleanor paused in her document gathering, considering. "My standard practice is to provide comprehensive proposals within 72 hours of initial consultation. You'll both receive detailed analyses by Thursday morning, including fee structures and timeline projections." "And Crawford's partnership offer?" Uncle Reginald asked. "Is something I'll consider carefully," Eleanor replied, "though I'm inclined to maintain independence. Partnership arrangements can complicate the kinds of innovative approaches that have made my practice successful." As she prepared to leave, the dining room looked like the set of a play after the final curtain. Props scattered, characters out of position, the artificial order of the performance replaced by the messy reality of genuine human emotion. Theodore emerged from the garden as Eleanor reached the foyer, his face pale but determined. "Eleanor, we need to talk. About Pemberton. About what this means for your career?" Eleanor finished gently. "We'll talk, Theodore. But not tonight. Tonight you need to process what you've learned, and I need to prepare for what comes next." She paused at the front door, looking back at the family that had spent 3 years constructing elaborate fictions about her failure. "For what it's worth, I never wanted to humiliate anyone tonight. I just wanted to practice law with integrity and competence. Everything else was simply the natural consequence of that choice." As Eleanor drove away from Rosewood Manor, her phone was already buzzing with text messages and missed calls. Word of the evening's revelations was spreading through the professional and social networks of Millbrook Heights, with the speed that characterized truly explosive gossip. By morning, Everyone who mattered in the city's legal and business communities would know that Eleanor Hartwell, the supposed family failure, had quietly built one of the most successful and innovative legal practices in the state. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the corner office of her expanded practice space on the 42nd floor of the Millennium Tower, watching the morning sun paint Millbrook Heights in shades of gold and amber. The city spread below her like a three-dimensional chessboard, each building representing opportunities, challenges, and relationships that comprised the complex ecosystem of corporate law practice. The intervening months had brought changes that would have seemed impossible to imagine during that fateful family dinner at Rosewood Manor. What had begun as a single evening's revelation had cascaded into a transformation that affected not just the Hartwell family but the entire legal landscape of the region. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria Ashworth. "Merger approved by regulators this morning. Your strategic framework saved us 8 months and $40 million in compliance costs. Champagne lunch to celebrate?" Eleanor smiled as she typed back her acceptance. The Ashworth Continental merger had become a case study in innovative legal strategy, referenced in business schools and bar association seminars as an example of how proactive analysis could transform corporate transactions. Harrison Blackthorne's development project had proceeded even more dramatically. Eleanor's alternative approach had not only avoided the zoning conflicts, but positioned the Millbrook Heights project as a model for sustainable urban development. The City Council had unanimously approved the revised plans, and architectural firms from 3 states were now studying the regulatory framework Eleanor had created for similar projects. But perhaps the most satisfying validation had come from an unexpected source. The State Bar Association had invited Eleanor to chair a new committee on ethical innovation in corporate law practice, a recognition that her approach represented more than individual success, but a potential model for reforming how legal services could be delivered. The morning's schedule included meetings with 2 potential clients, a conference call with federal regulators about environmental law evolution, and lunch with Crawford to finalize details of their collaboration agreement. Not a full partnership, Eleanor had maintained her independence, but a strategic alliance that gave her access to Crawford, Sterling's resources, while preserving the innovative flexibility that had made her practice successful. Her assistant knocked and entered with the day's correspondence. Among the usual client communications and regulatory updates was an envelope bearing the familiar letterhead of Pemberton Hayes and Associates. Eleanor opened it with curiosity rather than concern. The letter was from Theodore. "Dear Eleanor," it began in his careful handwriting, "I hope this finds you well and thriving, though from what I read in the business journals I have no doubt that you are. I wanted to update you on developments here, and to offer what I hope you'll accept as a sincere apology for the assumptions I made about your choices and capabilities." Eleanor settled into her reading chair by the window, interested to hear her brother's perspective on the changes that had affected them both. The investigation into Pemberton's billing practices concluded last month with results that I think you probably anticipated. The firm has been restructured under court supervision, with new management and comprehensive oversight of all client relationships. Several senior partners, including those who mentored me, are facing both professional sanctions and criminal charges. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. The patterns she had identified 3 years earlier had proved to be more extensive and systematic than even she had imagined. "I've been offered a position with the restructured firm, but I've decided to decline. Instead, I'm joining a smaller practice that specializes in environmental compliance, the kind of work where technical expertise matters more than political connections or billing efficiency. The partners there knew about your regulatory analysis work and were impressed enough by your reputation to consider me despite my association with Pemberton." The irony was both poetic and touching. Theodore's professional recovery was being facilitated by the very sister he had dismissed as a failure. "I've also been attending the ethics seminars you've been conducting for the Bar Association. Your presentation on proactive client service versus reactive billing was enlightening." I'm beginning to understand what you saw at Pemberton that I was too invested in the system to recognize. Eleanor smiled at this admission. Change was possible, even for people who had seemed entirely committed to their established worldviews. Mother asks about you constantly, though she's still processing the revelation that her failed daughter has become the most successful attorney in the family. She's proud, but also somewhat confused about how to incorporate this reality into her understanding of proper social hierarchy. I think you've fundamentally altered her entire framework for measuring success. The letter continued with updates about other family members. Aunt Vivienne now introduced Eleanor as my niece, the brilliant attorney at social gatherings. Uncle Reginald had begun recommending Eleanor's services to his real estate development clients, and Cousin Nathaniel had asked for advice about legal issues affecting his investment portfolio. I know that family approval was never something you needed or sought, Theodore concluded, but I want you to know that what you've accomplished has changed how all of us think about success, integrity, and the courage required to choose difficult paths that ultimately prove correct. I'm proud to be your brother, even if it took me far too long to realize what that actually meant. Eleanor set the letter aside and returned to the window, contemplating the view that had become symbolic of her journey from family disappointment to recognized leader in her field. The transformation hadn't been easy. 3 years of working in isolation, building relationships while maintaining independence, proving her approach through results rather than rhetoric. But the deeper satisfaction came from knowing that her success had been achieved without compromising the principles that had led her to leave Pemberton in the first place. She had proven that integrity and profitability weren't mutually exclusive, that innovation and ethics could coexist, that individual choices could indeed transform entire systems. Her phone rang with a call from a potential client in San Francisco, a tech company facing regulatory challenges that required exactly the kind of proactive analysis that had become Eleanor's specialty. As she answered, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The family dinner 6 months ago had been a revelation, but not the kind anyone had expected. It had revealed not just Eleanor's hidden success, but the limitations of traditional thinking about achievement, respect, and the courage required to choose authentic paths over convenient ones. Theodore had called her a failure who couldn't handle pressure. The family had constructed elaborate narratives about her inability to meet their standards of success. But what they had failed to understand was that their standards themselves were flawed. That true success required not just technical competence, but moral courage, innovative thinking, and the strength to build something meaningful rather than simply profitable. As Eleanor began discussing regulatory strategy with her San Francisco client, she realized that the most important lesson of her journey wasn't about legal practice or business success. It was about the power of choosing your own definition of achievement and having the patience to prove its validity through sustained excellence rather than immediate validation. The city sparkled in the morning light below her, full of opportunities for those brave enough to see beyond established limitations. Eleanor had proven that sometimes the best response to being underestimated wasn't argument or protest, but simply building something so undeniably excellent that recognition became inevitable. The family failure had become the family's success story, but more importantly, she had become exactly who she had always intended to be, an attorney who practiced law with integrity, innovation, and genuine service to her clients' needs. In the end, that was the only validation that had ever really mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.